Hey, what's up, people? So today we have a special interview that I did last week for you guys, okay? And we're interviewing a love and attachment coach, and I found it very fascinating because she fills in a lot of the gaps that I have in terms of my knowledge of human nature and such, right? And she's a certified board creative art specialist, and she knows her subject very, very well. In fact, she's pretty brilliant. Like as I was listening to her, I was like, yo, this lady is so brilliant. I'm like, man, I'm envious, right? So I know you guys are really gonna enjoy this interview. And I really hope that if you guys found this useful, you guys check her information on the description down below. All right, I'll put the link to her website, to her YouTube channel, and any other resources. Okay, and I highly recommend you guys check her out and subscribe to her channel. All right, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so let's begin this, and I hope you guys enjoy this interview. And please be nice to me. I know I'm not the best interviewer.
Brianna, okay, good. And I first heard about you because I saw an ad on Instagram about attachment styles. It was a pretty cool ad where it just came up like that on the side, stuff like that. I was like, that's so creative. And I saw some of your content, and I went into your website, and I was really fascinated because not only because of the subject, but because of how in depth you know your subject. You see what I'm saying? A lot of people know it, but on the surface, like me, only know the surface level of this, right? And I found it very fascinating because it's something that I've been trying to work on myself, right? But as a result, I wanted you to be on my channel and stuff like that, right? What were we saying before we finished? There was something that we were saying before we finished. What was it? Before we started? I forgot.
I'm not sure.
All right, good, good, good. So let me ask you this, what got you, tell me about yourself. What got you into this field? What do you do? How long you been doing it? Yeah.
Well, probably like everybody else who gets into this line of work, I do it because I had rocky romantic relationships, right? And so attachment itself is originally starts as the study of how we connect to loving, caretakers in childhood, and then we look at that as being kind of like a blueprint for how then we connect to loving figures in adulthood. So that's sort of like attachment in its most basic form. So I had a lot of disrupted attachments in my childhood. My parents divorced when I was really young, lots of bouncing around between homes, state to state. Parents got remarried and divorced, step siblings, blended family, lots of financial disruption, living on welfare, then being fine, then losing all of it. And then, so it kind of turned me into a bit of an overachiever because I thought, well, overachieving is my way out of this, right?
Mm.
So I always did really well in school and ate that stuff up and got really into psychology and art. And so when I went to college, I found creative arts therapy, which is basically you're trained like a psychotherapist, but you learn how to use creative modalities as a way to explore your unconscious impulses, basically.
Mhm.
So I'm a licensed and board certified creative arts therapist, and that's what I've been doing for about 14 years now. And attachment was a part of, it's just part of the curriculum, you have to learn about it. But the older I got, like even after I left grad school, and it wasn't until like a decade later, after going through all my own personal ups and downs with relationships, that did it finally, click. And then I thought, this needs to be an extension of what I do, because I think that we experience things because on some level it is an aspect of our reason for being here. And if I
Yeah,
can,
was it shocking when you realized all the connections your childhood had with your relationships?
well, it's funny. I was digging through some old papers and I realized I wrote this whole like thesis in graduate school, like almost more than 14 years ago. And I read it again recently. And I was like, oh my God, like I understood it then and never applied it until like a decade later.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, that was kind of like, oh, but it just, I think it just, I had a catalytic breakup like 4 years ago, and
What's that catalytic?
meaning like bad,
Oh, okay,
like
okay.
really bad, messy breakup. And just, it's one of those things where it hurts so much that you sort of reach that, like you reach that point in your life where you're like, whatever, I am the common denominator here. And so whatever I keep encountering, that I must have something to do with it. And so it's sort of like I had to just reconfigure the way I even thought about how I was showing up in relationships. And so that's sort of like, you know, you kind of hit a point where it's like, okay, I'm willing to surrender that I don't know everything, that maybe things aren't the way I think they are, and just kind of like finally being willing to open up to looking at things in a different way. And that was when I started, you know, watching YouTube videos and reading a lot of self-help books, and what I did know of attachment started to click with things. And I ended up actually writing a book about grief.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. I don't know too much about that. That's like one of those subjects I know nothing about.
Well, if you know about attachment, you know about grief.
Do you? Okay. I don't like to assume, you know. I like to
Well, I've seen some of your videos, and what you were talking about and some of the things that you're talking about, the way people are relating to each other. The way I would define that is they're struggling with grief, and like layers of grief over their lifetime, like little developmental experiences of loss. It's sort of like they have a term, it's called complicated grief. And so they say, if grief is like mourning the loss of someone who say has died, or you got a divorce and they moved away or something, if it's just mourning the loss of someone, then complicated grief is mourning the loss of wanting and mourning the loss of something that you never had and never will.
Complicated grief, could you define that?
So it's kind of like, it's when you, so like if we have these push-pull relationships, which I know you've been talking about on your channel, right?
It's not the nicest.
You know, but we have these push-pull relationships, and like you have these women, the way that I've heard you, just, you know, who just keep going back for more. It's like they're almost like a glutton for punishment, right? And there's something about the punishing quality of the partner that keeps them coming back, like almost like masochistic, right? Like they're, right. You know, and it's, the idea is that they're hoping to relive in order to revise some old wound from childhood. So they had a parent that they were never good enough for, or they had a parent who didn't acknowledge them or didn't love them in the ways that they needed to be loved. And so they understand love in that way. And if I can just get my partner to give me what my parent never gave me, then I can heal this wound, and then I will be okay. Then I'll be happy, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of like literally hardwired into our pathways in our limbic brain and the synaptic part of our brain. And it actually lights up in the same parts of the brain as when a mother looks at pictures of her newborn infant, and when a drug addict looks at pictures of drug paraphernalia. Wow. So
why is it so hard to notice the link? You know, because it feels like it has nothing to do with the past. You know what I'm saying? Like in the moment, you just see it from the present moment. You don't, you know, like unless you do some introspection, what do you think is so hard to notice the origin of those things?
Well, I think we're not really trained to do a lot of introspection, right? We're kind of trained from birth to give authority to the people around us. And, you know, for example, you're a kid and you're jumping around from the couch to the floor, from the coffee table to the chair, and you're tying a cape around your neck, and you're like, look, I'm Superman, you know, look at me go. And so in that moment, as a child, you are experimenting with, what are my capacities? What you're allowing your imagination to create narratives for yourself. Like you're testing reality, right? How true is this? And you can have a parent who says, oh, look at you, Superman, look at you go, you're so big and strong, right? Or you have someone who says, I just cleaned that rug, shut up, sit down, you are ruining my furniture, can't you see that I'm having a hard time here? Oh, everything I do for you and you pay no attention, and blah, 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 right? So ungrateful. So this is obviously this is an exaggerated spectrum of that we're talking about here, but you know, and you're not going to ruin your kid if you just clean the living room and you're upset that they're dragging mud across it. But if that's your response every single time that child is trying to be playful, or every single time that child is trying to express themselves creatively, or every single time that child is trying to test their own agency in the world, then they are going to think from this high authority figure that is telling them what they are worth and what they are valued, they are going to think the furniture is more important than me. The whatever is going on out there is more important than whatever's going on in here. So I'm going to completely ignore, suppress, deny, not pay attention to whatever's going on in here, and I'm going to trust everything else and everyone else outside of me to tell me who and what I am and what it is that I need to value in this world, right? And so over time, that so we end up engaging with our external environments, the partners that we attract, without having any kind of like rituals or practices for having that internal state of reflection. Like, why did I just do that? Why did I say that? Oh, I'm feeling upset today. I wonder what that's about. Like, we don't just breathe, you know, like we just don't do that.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like our thinking mind doesn't really let us give us access to our emotional mind per se.
Mm-hmm,
You know?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know, I was thinking about that, and one of the reasons why I think it is, I don't know, is because when we're experiencing those emotions, we really haven't developed our cognitively, our ability to self-reflect. Sometimes we don't even have that ability to self-reflect when we go through those experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like a ringing in our ears that we had our whole lives. We think that those emotions are just prefixed in there. We don't think that's something wrong with that, and that's something you could fix. You know, it's kind of like,
I love that metaphor you just used, the ringing in your ears.
I just had it today. I just went to the eye doctor.
So good because
Okay.
yeah, because it's like it's a trauma response. So like what I was just describing, you know, the harsh reaction to something like, which we might consider a normal childhood experience, we would call like a developmental trauma. And if you can imagine a situation like that at school, teacher, shut up, sit down, sit in these uncomfortable chairs, don't talk, you know, learn in exactly this way, but maybe not in the way that you learn best, you know. And so we encounter that in every single facet of our lives. It's like an assault on the body, because the body is the first organizer of experience. If you can imagine your body, you know, taste, sound, touch, like your body when you are young is how you take in all the information around you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you can imagine, and then we have an emotional response to that information, and then that travels to the brain, and then the brain decides what kind of information it is, and then it sends it to your neocortex, which is your cognitive, like you said, like where we start to have higher thinking processes about things, or it gets stuck in the limbic part, which is the primal part, which is mood, food, sleep, also the part that's connected with attachment and with addiction and grief. And it gets stuck there. And if it's strong enough, because the body floods with something like cortisol, and all of that impacts the ability for that information to be integrated into like your higher cognition, which we might think of as also a way that we start to have consciousness around things, right? So it's like you just got assaulted by something and there's a ringing in your ears. And if you're always hearing that ringing in your ears, meaning like every stage of your development was met with these little kind of dismissive traumas from people you were encountering, that's what you believe your reality is. That's just the way it is. So it's like it now becomes a fan whirring in the background. It's just always there. You just assume that's how it is. And then one day someone turns the fan off and you're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
it could be like this.
Something bad, or someone triggers the emotions you were trying to suppress all those years.
Yeah.
You realize you have no choice to either face it or go deeper into that abyss.
Yeah.
You know, and let me ask you. So I have some questions that people ask me, and I want you to answer them too, if you could, for me, please.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's because, like, how can I say it? Me, I'm the type of person, I know the things that I don't know. All right, and to me,
that's a wise man.
Yeah, I guess.
A wise man knows that he knows nothing.
Yeah, I suppose, right? But it's because, you know, nobody wants to be one of those know-it-all people, right? I have my own limitations, right? So, and also because me, I just realized I'm more of like I'm an avoidant, anxious type of attachment kind of person, right? Like if I want to be close to you, but if you get too close, I need some distance. And I used to think that there was something wrong with me. But then after like studying this for my own self, I was reading this book, The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. I don't know if you heard of it.
I haven't. I'll check it out.
Oh, he's amazing. He if you love human nature, he talks about that, right? And anyway, so let me just read these things, right? Because it's fine, it's very interesting. So can you explain the different types of attachment styles?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes. So there's lots of research and there's lots of different like names in the literature for these different things, but I tend to follow Mary Main's research, which I think is a little clearer. But basically there's 4 attachment styles. So the first one is called anxious attachment. Sometimes it's called anxious-ambivalent. Sometimes it's called anxious preoccupied. But overall, we're describing people who tend to be more anxious. They tend to be more clingy. They tend to be very preoccupied with what their partner's doing all the time. It's sort of like their every waking thought. You know, if they're in a relationship, their every waking thought is about what their partner needs doing, is how they are responding to them. Or if they're not in a relationship, thinking about how can I get into a relationship. So there's a lot of sense of personal value tied up in being in partnership. They're also really giving. They're really generous. They can be very creative. They're also very forgiving, you know, and they have a lot of motivation and compassion for their partners and a willingness to make things work. And they're also very good at picking up on emotional cues. Sometimes that can also be their downfall, though, because they can become hypervigilant about it, and then they may jump to a negative assumption about something, thinking they accurately pick up that someone's having a bad day or that someone's upset, but then they inaccurately assume it's their fault. And so then they may try to be over helpful in order to compensate, and it only ends up annoying their partner because their partner's like, why are you trying to make everything about you, right? So that's kind of someone who's more anxious. I refer to them as open hearts, though, because I think language constructs our realities in a big way. And if we are referring to ourselves with these very sterile, sort of negative words, I have this, okay, I'll finish.
I can see it much clearly once you said that. Like, it makes so much more sense. Because that means your heart is open to receive and also to get hurt.
Yeah, and then boundaries is really what you have to learn, right? For everyone. But so then the other end of that spectrum, we have avoidant partners, and avoidant partners are people who typically need a lot of space and independence in a partnership. So you might say anxious open hearts prioritize more feeling understood and supported, whereas avoidant individuals prefer feeling respected, and they like feeling as though they are given enough space to pursue their own passions. If they want to be supported, they want to be supported in what they are doing. They feel supported by being respected. And it's not always, they go together, but there's a subtle difference, because an open heart, oh, he just sees me, he gets me, he knows me, I love that, and that's like a big turn on for them. But the person who gets them and sees them but also treats them like shit isn't going to dissuade them, because they feel like, oh, I feel seen, because they don't ever feel seen. And then they think, and deep down they kind of think they're not worthy of love. So if someone is avoidant and presents a challenge to them.
Which one?
Both of them, actually.
Both of them.
But an anxious person approaches it differently than an avoidant person will.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And the thing that's kind of interesting is an avoidant person will be avoidant until they meet someone more avoidant than them, and then they become kind of anxious.
Yeah, it's funny how that works, right? I tell that to women, that if you meet a guy that's really has a lot of options, the best way to stand out is to be more distant than he is, because that offends them. That offends their pride.
Yeah, well, it offends them, but it also presents the challenge that they've been lacking. And this is why I say these are actually more similar than they are different. We see it as opposites attract, but it's actually that they are both operating under the same paradigm. They just express it outwardly in what appear to be opposing ways. Whoa. So like the avoidant person, for example, they like a lot of space. They like independence in a relationship, but they also can feel smothered in relationship. They also can feel like they get irritated by their partner, and they usually attract anxious partners. They get irritated by them because as much as they feel attracted to the vitality of an open heart, as much as they feel attracted to the effusiveness and the, open hearts really do have kind of a pulse, like a finger on the pulse, like they're very vivacious. And so I think avoidant partners tend to be attracted to someone like that. But at the same time, they're attracted to it because within themselves, they have suppressed and or cut off some of their own vivaciousness. Because
you think
it makes them vulnerable. They think it makes them weak. They think it makes them susceptible to emotional manipulation. Mm-hmm. So then when that vivaciousness turns into, you wouldn't do that if you really loved me. Now the avoidant partner feels, you're not going to emotionally manipulate me. I am not going to be controlled by that. Peace, right?
Yeah.
So, but what the irony is that if an anxious person is chasing an avoidant person, then there's something they're avoiding within themselves. There's something that they're actually afraid to receive. You wouldn't keep chasing someone who doesn't give you what you want if that's what you really wanted,
Yeah, yeah.
You know, so avoidant partners know the feeling of anxiety. They wouldn't be avoidant if they didn't. You're avoidant because you're avoiding the fear of feeling anxious, because you hate that feeling. So you learn to cut it off and you learn not to identify with it. So then the anxious person also hates feeling anxious, but instead of cutting it off and trying to do turning in on the self, instead they reach for an external thing to alleviate the feeling for as long as they can. So it's both actually degrees of avoidance, but it's just turned outward or turned inward.
Yeah, I'm that way wherein like I deal with my anxiety with smoking weed and like, but at the same time it makes me sometimes more isolated, which deals with my desire for distance. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like, I've always wondered like which one is easier to change. I think it's harder to change if you're an avoidant. I'm like,
well,
that.
the research would support your opinion. You know, what research has been done says that anxious partners tend to be more open and willing to say because they are wanting to work on it, you know, because we can talk about values, you know, they're already valuing the idea of a relationship, right? They already value it and think of it as a positive experience, even if they've been somewhat tumultuous, right? Now, avoidant partners, they're kind of like, what the fuck do I need a relationship for? Sex and maybe sharing resources, right? So, and it's likely, and of course, these are the reasons for these things is because that has been their experience. It doesn't come out of nowhere.
Why is it? Why are they so obsessed with sex? Why is it so dry and simplistic that what they see? You know what I'm saying? Because I'm like that, you know.
Well, avoidance, I think that because it's actually the same thing with anxious partners too, is that when you experience relationships as a power dynamic, and both do, actually, both ends of the spectrum do, and incidentally, disorganized attachment, which is someone who experiences these two ends of the stick at like a high volume, so someone who's more avoidant tends to act and think and behave this way more often than not, right? There'll be a little bit of anxiety in there, but they're more often want distance, don't jump in too quickly, blah, blah, blah. An anxious partner, more often than not, tends to be clingy, tends to want to have a lot of emotional contact, tends to want to spend a lot of time with you, but there's a level of avoidance within them as well, right? But it's about a frequency. So more often than not, they might hang out on this end of the stick, right? If you've got someone who's what is sometimes called disorganized or fearful avoidant or anxious avoidant, it means that they have both ends of that spectrum. They're a little bit more towards the middle, where it's almost like you've got two radios blaring two completely different genres of music, and it's like at a high volume. And so that creates a tremendous amount of anxiety because you have a lot of ambivalence. Like there's a lot of friction going on inside you. Like you want closeness, but you don't want it. You feel very infatuated and really into someone, and then it's like 3 months go by and all of a sudden they're gone, feeling's gone.
It's like when you're lonely, but you don't want to socialize.
Right. Which right now is a great time for folks like that.
Right. So it's the best time for the introverts. Yeah. It's because I'm that way wherein like sometimes I do want to make more friends, but at the same time, it's kind of like I'm too comfortable with my habits. If I look at people with friends with a lot, it's not that I don't have friends, but I have a few friends. When I look at people with a lot of friends, I feel envy. But then it's kind of like once I'm in that situation, once I'm with my friends, I need some distance.
You're exhausted.
Yeah, what the fuck? So it's kind of like, how do they change? How could they change? Like, is it possible? You know what I'm saying? How do you, because what I began to do, this is what I noticed. When I travel and I'm in the place that I don't know anybody, I'm more open to make friends. When I'm here in my comfort zone, I'm like, I don't need that many friends. I'm good, you know? So I don't know. But what are the strategies for those people to change for the positive, not for the negative?
Well, so that's an ongoing question and debate in the realms of attachment research. But what they've found is that, like if you're in therapy, you need to be doing some kind of work, like some kind of therapy, self-reflective. It can't be done alone in isolation. It's just going to reinforce the same old constructs that you have around relatedness, right? It's your ideas about what serves you and what doesn't serve you. They have to be challenged a little bit. And you have to establish enough of a trusting rapport with someone that you value them enough that when they challenge you, you're willing to accept that challenge, basically, which is why partners who really do have what's called dismissive avoidance only typically make it into therapy when they've had a major attachment issue. So for example, they do love a partner, but they haven't been connecting on, you know, a deep emotional level. And that partner's like, that's it, I'm getting a divorce unless we do this, right? Or partner, because they can, avoidant partners do get married, can have long-term relationships, can commit to those things, but their partners will experience them as emotionally unavailable, or they're experience them as almost as if there's like a veil between them, like in the relationship, and they just feel like they want the connection to deepen, but it's almost like the more they're committed, the less deep the partner becomes. And then they start having, what's that, FOMO, fear of missing out, right? And so then they start romanticizing, you know, whatever their life would have been if I hadn't have made this decision, right? And so they sort of use
the avoidance.
Yeah.
Wow.
So what brings them into therapy is or other research has also shown things like warfare. If they're a soldier and they end up experiencing some kind of PTSD, that's going to crack them open like a nut. Or having a child that has a major disability or chronic illness.
Why?
Because it's going to rattle their most essential attachment wounds themselves. Because a child is an extension of you, and the child is going to be very helpless and needy. And this is an obligation. And this is the other thing too, I will say, for clients that I have met that are more avoidant, they're often assumed to be, you know, commitment phobes or, you know, whatever. But I actually find that most avoidant partners actually take commitment tremendously seriously, which is why they are so averse to it. Because if and when they do commit themselves to something, it's like they're integrating it into one of those routines that you described that's really hard to break, and they know that that's what they're going to do, so they will stave it off for as long as humanly possible, because they actually feel a very deep sense of obligation to what commitments they will make. And so, you know, if you have someone who has a more avoidant attachment style who then has a child, if they make that decision, it was probably a very big one for them, and then that child has some kind of disability or chronic illness, then it is going to constantly be pulling at what their original attachment wounds are themselves, because you can't be absent in a relationship like that.
So what is going to make them more open emotionally?
Yeah, like it kind of cracks them open on an emotional level.
Yeah, it's funny because I remember one time last year I'm the same way with my parents. I tend to be very cold with them, and then not because I don't like them, but because I need some distance. My mom is more of like an anxious type. So she pushes me away with the amount of attention. I'm like, yo, I need some distance, mom. You know what I'm saying? And that offends her. It's like she doesn't get it. You know what I'm saying? But I noticed what cracked it was one time I was I smoke a lot of weed. Okay, not for this. I don't smoke. Okay, but I definitely use it to self-soothe. And one time I smoked a little bit too much, right? And then one day I was reading this book called, again, The Laws of Human Nature. There's a chapter on it that's called Death Denial, Contemplating on Your Own Mortality. And when I listened to it while I was pretty high, the thought of death and the death of my family just brought me more closer. And I was like feeling anxious. I was like, I need to see them. Something could happen. And when I went there, it was different because I thought the thought of them dying one day made me miss them a lot more. You know what I'm saying? And so it's kind of like it's like maybe something that wounds you, or maybe something that, I don't know. It's like death definitely opens up the heart of people who are closed. As you see, when there's a tragedy, people who are closed come out and become more social.
Yeah. Well, it's like a part of their ego makes it okay to do so, right? Wow. That, like, there's something in the environment or in the circumstance that they can tell themselves, okay, it's appropriate to show up in this way now, right? Because the context, it calls for it.
Yeah. So how could they change though? What are some of the things that you recommend for people who are avoidant and anxious to go towards more of a secure attachment?
Well, it's interesting because the context changes depending on, like, if you were a therapist and I was telling you as a therapist, like, here are the ways that you might approach it, right? But if you are just, you want to do your own self-work kind of thing, then I would say you want to establish connections with people that actually, I recommend not trying to work on this in a romantic context at first, because you're just going to get triggered over and over and over and over again. And you're going to feel like, God, this is so not worth it. And it's only going to end up like reinforcing your coping skills, basically. But I actually, you know, you were talking about, I see people who have a lot of friends and I envy that, but then I get myself in a similar situation. I feel exhausted. That actually sounds like a really wonderful place to start playing with your energetic boundaries around connection, right? Because it may be that you're sort of, it's like an expansion and a contraction, right? Like, I like hanging out with all these people. I get into new environments and it feels exciting and stimulating, but then I have to come back in and I have to isolate and I have to self-soothe because I feel energetically like depleted, right? So it's almost like you or anyone else who I'm sure connects with what you're saying has this, this experience of boundaries as being all in or all out, right? And so I think, you know, in our platonic relationships, maybe exploring, okay, so when do I notice myself starting to feel depleted at an outing with friends, right? Or when do I notice texting and talking to this person throughout the week starts to feel like too much, right? And in those moments, can I work on like just explicitly stating, you know, and I guess tactfully, you know, hey, can I hit you up next week? You know, this week I still, you know, there's other things I got to attend to, right? Or something like that. And because that then becomes like a template for then moving that into the much more scary and stimulating realm of romantic partnership, right? The other thing is working with metaphor. So usually if we are trying to hit something head on, we only add more momentum to the thing we're trying to change, right? So for example, it could be someone, I'll take an anxious example because I think it could also, I think the avoidant partner could have a similar inner monologue, which is, so I know I have these avoidant tendencies and I'm trying to change because my experience has taught me that I think and I believe, and a part of me knows that there must be something delicious and exciting and reciprocal about a loving relationship. Like there must be some depth of meaning and purpose that exists in that context. And it's something that I haven't really experienced to the fullness of what I believe is possible. And so there's a part of you that is willing, that does believe, even if you're asking the question, right? So in asking the question, you must also have a concept that it exists. And so then you're like, but I have these tendencies, right? And so then begins this downward spiral of, but since I have these tendencies, even if I got a healthy, secure partner, I'd probably fuck it up anyway. And then they'd be hurt. And then I'd feel even worse about myself and right? So now we have a double trouble. So now not only are you aware of you're aware of your avoidant tendencies, which is kind of like step one, yay, like bird's eye view, great. Now I can make choices about this thing I see and witness within myself. And then the second, then you're like, oh, now I have these tendencies. What am I going to do about it? So now you have like a double trouble, right? And so I think that's more where we step into like compassion, like self-compassion. Like, so security is not that you need to eliminate your avoidant tendencies. Security is being aware of them and being allowing of them, and then being okay with like wherever you are in the moment. And the more you can allow yourself to just be who and what you are and be okay in the moment with that, then the more you start to allow other people to be okay with who and what they are and where they are in their process. And then you meet someone and you're like, oh, we're both kind of messed up, but we're like kind of messed up together and we're willing to be honest about our messed upness. And in some ways that actually kind of makes, you know, our messed upness actually makes us kind of perfect for each other. And like, look at all these co-creative, amazing things that we can, you know, explore through these dialogues that we can have, right?
It's almost like you're giving yourself the love that you really want. It's almost like, how can I say, it's kind of like, I know what you mean. It's kind of like, I do this with myself. Like whenever I don't believe in something, like let's say I have a goal in my head, right? And I don't believe I could do it. A part of me does believe because I'm trying to believe.
Yeah.
So what I tell myself is, hey, the part that doesn't believe, it's okay. I understand why you don't believe it. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not trying to change you. And it's almost like you're giving it. It's almost like that part